Good morning. How's everybody doing? Good? Oh man, we need some sunshine, huh? So I got a couple announcements. My name is Roland. I'm one of the leaders here at Rethink Church. We are glad you're here this morning. First is Rooted. Rooted is coming up. Rooted is a 10-week small group. Don't be intimidated by 10 weeks. It goes by really fast. This is an opportunity to grow deeper in your relationship with God. It's a guided workbook, and we go through it together. It does it in a really unique way. So we have a QR code up here. If you're interested, you can scan that. And they're going to be starting February 2nd. We're going to be meeting every week at 6:30. Again, this is a great opportunity. If you think you're a mature Christian, or if you're brand new, this is for all levels of your spirituality walk. So if you're interested, scan this QR code. If you're new here this morning, I want to welcome you. We're glad you're here. Whether you're a new Christian or you're just looking for a new home, we would love to get to know you and hear your story. So you can talk with us at the back after the service, or you can meet us at the guest services area. And we have a surprise for you, right? A gift for you, and just to thank you. And we want to hear your story and let you know that you're cared for and loved here at Rethink Church. We also have tithing. This is an opportunity to give back to God from your heart, to check your heart and your mind and your time, talent, and treasure, and give back to God what already belongs to Him. So there's a couple of ways to do that. You can go to rethink.cc, click the Give tab, and give there. Or we have a black box in the back. You can also give there, check or cash. And it goes a long way, so we appreciate that. And next week is Mission Week. Last year, we were able to help rescue 3 people from human trafficking. That's pretty amazing. To restore 3 people whose lives were stolen from them and help them get it back. And also give glory to God through that. So next week's Mission Week. This is an opportunity to tithe and give beyond your normal giving and help save lives. So bring some extra money next week for that. We've been talking about spiritual disciplines, fasting. We talked about silence and solitude last week. With silence is probably harder for me than I thought, right? And being on the phone or the TV or the radio in the car, it was a lot harder than I thought. So I'm glad for that message. This week is a Sabbath, which is probably my most natural one. Yeah. Every day is a Sabbath for Roland. At my last job, we had gears that you had to work in, right? Gear 1 was rest, all the way through like social, and then 5 was like, don't talk to me, I'm in gear 5 working. I was always in gear 1. Gear 1 is my natural state, man. So open your minds, open your hearts this morning to the Sabbath, to giving to God what is His, to resting in Him, to remembering all the blessings He gives you. This is a perfect opportunity to lean in to God's message to you this morning.
All right. Well, hey, my name is Mark at the Pastor Church, and I'm excited for today. In fact, we're going to break it up into 2 segments. So this week will be kind of like a foundation level of what this is all about. And then next week, how do we actually work this out? Here's what we've been doing this last few weeks going. We have no clue how long this will take, by the way. I just don't put timelines on things, let's put it that way. So but what we've been looking at is how did followers of Jesus, like thousands of years ago, start this whole process to the point where they were, like if they're illiterate, they didn't have a Bible, how did they shape their lives around these practices, these habits, that grew to the point where in a couple hundred years, there's 1 million of them in the Roman Empire, which by the way, there's also a huge population in Africa and also in Asia, and it literally transformed the world. So how did this happen when it's just a handful of people who were slaves, a third of the Roman Empire were slaves? How did this work, right? And so I think sometimes we get a little too comfortable in our, what I call churchianity. So let's reshape this. And so we've been working through this, and like Roland said, fasting and silence and solitude, and now we're into Sabbath. And we have this weird dichotomy in our culture because we have pockets of our population that is way overworked. We also have pockets of our population that are way underworked.
Come
on purpose, right? And so we've been talking about this. How do we actually work this out? And so in this process, what we want to do is work into this. And I think here in America, you guys know I'm a nerd when it comes to like work study and stuff like that. And so as Americans, on average, we work more than 167 hours more, or 137 hours more than Japanese people. On average, we work more, 260 hours more than British people. And we work 499 hours more than French people. Which kind of explains a lot, right? So, and yet at the same time, we have 7 million able-bodied men in their prime who are willing to not work. 7 million able-bodied people from 23 to 52 age range who are saying, we don't need to work. And research is showing that their screen time is 2,000 hours a year. 5.5 hours a day. And they're willing to sit there and do this. In my opinion, and I'm adding this to the research, they're consuming from the population, they're not contributing to the society. That's just my addition. So, how do we actually work this out? What does this look like for us to do that? And we have this weird dichotomy. This guy, Michael Ziccarelli from Messiah University, spent 5 years researching this. He surveyed 20,000 plus followers of Jesus in 139 countries, age range from 15 to 88, asking this one question. What are the obstacles that keep you from maturing in your relationship with Jesus? What are the things? And here's the summary of a 5-year study. Here's what he said. I'm going to give you in 4 different points. The first one is this, that Christians in today's culture are assimilating to the culture of busyness, hurry, overload, which leads to them to, number 2, marginalizing God. Just giving God the extra, the leftovers, I should say. And so, this leads them to, number 3, a deteriorating relationship with God. And number 4, that Christians are leaving themselves vulnerable of becoming more busy, more hurried, more overworked, more overloaded, and just acting and looking and being like the culture around them. And if you look at the church, is there any difference between American culture and the church culture? And here are the top 3 professions of followers of Jesus who are at risk of doing this. Doctors, lawyers, and pastors. Yep, right? So, all of these things, and so we have to walk into this saying, okay, what does it look like? And why is the Sabbath such an important, crucial aspect of life? And we have to remember we have 3 enemies of our soul. 3 enemies that are wanting to kill, steal from you, and destroy your life, right? We have Satan, we have our own flesh, like our natural self, but then we also have sinful society. And here's how this plays out. Satan comes along, or the devil, whatever title you want to give him, and he gives us a deceptive idea. He plants this idea, he twists the truth of God in such a way, maybe 1 degree, maybe 2 degrees, but somehow he deceives us. And out of that deception, that leads us to a disordered desire. Right? And it leads us to wanting something different that's out of order than God's order. And as a result of that, all individuals within our society are doing that. That creates sinful societies. And so if you just simply watch this play out, let's take the topic of sex. Right? Did Satan create sex? No. God did. But how does this get played out in our culture? Deceptive idea, disordered desires, sinful societies. And look at it, just drive down the street and you see it all over the place. Right? You see the impacts of just that kind of a thing going on here. And this is part of this process of this overworked, overbusy. Dallas Willard said that busyness is the #1 weapon that Satan has against Christians to keep us from following Jesus to our full capacity. Just keep staying busy. Just stay overbusy, overloaded, and all that. 1950 psychologists coined this term of hurried sickness, that people literally couldn't sit still. And they started recognizing it was because of the pace of their life, and the pace of their life was trying to keep up with the economy around them. And in the 1950s, they were starting to see this change of the economy. In the 1920s, businesses went from a needs-based business to a wants-based business. Meaning, if you had a car, and as long as it was working, just keep driving. Does that make sense? And if it broke, then you would replace it. If it didn't break, then don't worry about it, right? And so, in the 1920s, business people recognized this saying, hey, by the way, if you want to be successful in business, you're going to have to keep making them want to buy more of your things. And so quality started going down. and all this. 1920s, they were very adamant about saying we're not actually making products, we're actually conditioning people to rely on us. And if you watch the advertisement increase, the mass advertisement went off the charts in 1920s, 30s, and all of that. What happened around the 1920s? Great Depression, right? So if you change this, then all of a sudden you're like, okay. So as a result, 30-ish years later, you have this hurry sickness of people trying to keep up with this economy, trying to say, man, it's not enough just to have an oven for 10 years. If I don't have the latest oven, I'm feeling left out. And anyone ever watch advertisements feeling, man, I'm just left out. I don't have fill in the blank, right? And so we just constantly do this. And so when you have an economy based like that, then you have this pace of life that's almost unsustainable. And now we have hurry sickness, we have more people on antidepressants than ever, we have more people in counseling, and I'm not against counseling medications or anything, I'm just saying, if this is the result of this, maybe there's a way that we could actually reverse this, that we could resist this. And it's almost like our Creator is like knew this about us. And was like, hey, by the way, from the very beginning, let's institute this thing called the Sabbath. And that's part of this process, right? So here's the words of Jesus. He says this in Matthew chapter 11. We're going to unpack this more next week. But this is fascinating to me. Here's what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 11. He says this: "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened." Anyone walk in a little bit burdened today? Anyone a little weary today? Here's what Jesus says: "Come to me and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus is a Jewish rabbi living in Roman-occupied Israel, and he's making this claim that you can come to him and somehow you'll find rest. In a place where they're taxed 80 to 85%, Roman Empire ruling, all that. Israelites people are seen as less than human in the Roman Empire's ways. And yet, this Jewish rabbi can make this claim: come to me, and I'll give you rest. The yoke phrase here is the set of his teachings. It's how he interprets the Hebrew Scriptures and how he's applying that. And because of that, he's saying, my teaching is going to be easy, my burden is going to be light. So what does this look like, and how is he going to give us rest in this kind of a thing? The Jewish understanding of it in the early church it's not that Sabbath was optional. Sabbath was just a foundational part of life. And I don't know about you, but I've never grown up thinking that Sabbath was a foundational part of life. I watched my mom as a single mom work 3 to 4 jobs, hardly ever taking a rest. If, at most, she probably slept 3 to 4 hours a night. Does that make sense? Working first shift, second shift, and sometimes optional third shift type things along the way. So, here's the question. How did we get so far away from this idea of the foundational part of life to being optional? I grew up and I went to college to be a pastor, and in my teachings there, Sabbath was never seen as an actual part of life. It was, if you're successful, you can take a day off as a pastor. That was kind of how, it wasn't come out and said it, but it implied. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so, there, the agenda behind it, whatever the motto behind it, was basically, if you're successful, you'd be on a staff, with church with staff, and then they can just take over the rest of the days, and you guys divvy out the days off. Does that make sense? And so, and not seen as an actual part of life and how we actually do this. So, next week we'll unpack Matthew chapter 11, but Jesus makes this claim, but here's the deal. Every time Jesus is asked a question, he refers back to the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And I'm just going to make this statement, we'll unpack it next week a little bit more. I think Jesus is actually part of the Pharisee sect, and he has tons of criticism from the inside. He's calling out Pharisees from the inside. We'll let it sit there. We'll talk about it next week. And so, I think what he's saying is hey, Pharisees, you constantly ask this question, and all you keep doing is going back to Moses, but let's go back to the very beginning. So let's go to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. All right? Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God creates the whole earth, and we can get into that debate, but we won't get into it. So Genesis chapter 1 and 2, he says this: the sixth day, God creates animals, and he says, be fruitful and multiply. He blesses the animals, saying, go be fruitful and multiply. And then, out of the dust, he creates humans, or Adam, right? And he was human, Adam had form, but he wasn't human yet. It wasn't until the next part where God breathes his ruach, his spirit, into humans, and now what we call it, we call them embodied souls. That's what we are. We are souls that have a body to us. And so now we can do this. And so some time goes on and God recognizes that it's not good for man to be alone. Right? And so he looks for the animal kingdom for a suitable helper. Thank God he didn't find anything in the animal kingdom. Yeah, right? So then he causes Adam to go to sleep. He gives him rest, whatever that was. And then he forms Eve out of the rib of Adam, which is foundational to us. This is extremely telling. He doesn't take something out of Adam's foot. He doesn't take something out of Adam's head. Meaning that humans, which we'll get into, Adam is the word for human. Eve is the word of life in Hebrew. Humans are supposed to rule this earth, and not rule it like authoritative, but capture the potential of earth side by side. And you see this all throughout scriptures. And it gets twisted. Remember that deceptive idea? It gets twisted throughout humans where one gender ruling over another gender. But that was never God's intention. So, that being said, he blesses Adam and Eve, and he says, be fruitful and multiply, right? Second thing that he blesses. And then you get to Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, and he gets to the seventh day, and he blesses time. And he says, this is a holy day. This is a day to be set apart. Was God tired? No. Ever get to the point where you just want to enjoy your work? Have you ever gone through a project and you're like, man, this is awesome. Yeah. This is what God is doing. He's delighting in his creation. And he's just sitting back and, man, this is awesome. He calls it very, very good. Tov, tov, in the Hebrew. And he's like, man, this is awesome. Look what I just did. And all he really did was speak things into existence. And then he just sat back. And he delights in it. The Hebrew word is Shabbat, and we just simply rest in this. It's a cease of working, and he's just hanging out, and he's looking at his creation going, man, this is great, right? Think about the orientation of humans' day, though, humanity's day. Day 6, Adam is created, and Eve. Day 7, they rest. Day 8, they get to work. Humans, we do not have to work and earn our rest. We actually work from our place of rest. And this is crucial for us to understand. If we just simply think we have to work and get everything done and then we could rest, we'll never get it done. Does that make sense? But if you can learn how to rest and then out of that source work, now you're living like Genesis chapters 1 and 2. Now you're living in the rhythm that God created. And there's a flow. If you've noticed this in the Hebrew, if you've read this, it says there was evening and then there was day. Somehow in Western cultures, we have this weird time that the morning starts at 12 a.m. But if you've ever worked an off shift, a second shift, and you have to call your supervisor at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., they don't really love it. Let's put it that way, right? I remember calling one of my bosses. It was the machine went down. It was down for 4 hours, and anytime the machine was over 4 hours, I had to call the supervisor. And we hit that 4-hour mark at 1 a.m. And Chuck, my boss, will answer the phone. He was not happy. Woke him up at 1 a.m. And I was like, hey, it's in the morning, good morning. And he was like, it is not the morning, it's the middle of the night, right? 1 a.m. does not feel like the morning, but somehow we assume that it is, right? Technically speaking, it turned into the morning. Well, in the Hebrew idea, the mindset, it's the sundown to the sundown is the day. And this is crucial. Eugene Peterson writes this about this aspect. Number one is, he says this, the Hebrew evening morning sequence conditions us to the rhythms of grace. We go to sleep, and God begins his work. We wake up in a world that we did not make, into a salvation that we did not earn. When we go to sleep, God's still working, holding this universe in place. And things that we can't even explain get done. It's not that we get working and all of a sudden now God shows up. He's like, oh, humans are working, we should probably be there. No, he's working this whole time. But how screwed up is it that we have this mindset that we get to work and then God, can you come help me with my job? Right? This whole rhythm of Sabbath is that we go to sleep and then God works. And this is how you see it in day 6, and day 7, and day 8. Right? And this is part of that rhythm of grace I need to get into. The first principle of the Sabbath is that we do not have to earn it, we just simply embrace it. We just simply say, okay, God, I didn't do anything to earn this. This is part of my identity. This is who you've created me to be. Not to do things. We've been human doings for a long time. But we're called human beings. And part of that being is learning how to just simply be with God. And what does that look like for us to just simply say, okay, God, I'm going to orient everything in my life around my identity to be with you. I'm a creation of yours. And like we said this when Jesus was baptized, God says, this is my son whom I'm well pleased, and he says it about every single child that he has. Before you perform anything, that is who God sees you as. And so, when we show up to work, we're not showing up to work to earn anything, we're showing up from a source of rest, from a source of who he is as our identity, from our source of salvation. And we just simply show up and say, okay, God, how do you want me to work today? It's not, let me do all these things, and then, God, can you come bless this? And if we live like that, then we're kind of messing the whole thing up. But if we step in and say, okay, God, I guess, I'm from my identity, I'm a child of yours, and this is the job you have for me, how do you want me to show up and do this? It's a completely different mind shift, right? But in our Western American world, it's all about earning, it's all about all this other stuff. And God's like, no, let's do this as a result of this. And so, part of this process, we've been talking about this last couple of weeks, is we live in such chaos that we have to somehow let our waters settle, right? And we're working so at a pace that is just outrageous and ununderstanding that every time we feel like the waters are starting to settle, we shake it back up. But the Sabbath is simply saying, okay, we're just going to let this rest. And all the things of our life will settle into place after we do this. Now, there's a flip side of this. Did you notice how many days that God actually worked? 6 days.
6 days.
Brace yourselves. You may feel pain here. Some of you work for 1 day and you're like, oh, I need 6 days to rest. And that's because you're lazy. And entitled. And that's not what God wants.
Yeah.
We live in a entitled generation that says, give me, give me. I'm not saying everyone. I'm saying there's a good portion of our community, our society that says that.
Yeah.
And they want to consume without contribution. Right? There's this tension. We have 7 million able-bodied men who are unwilling to work. That takes a toll on society.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? And so part of this process is if you're looking and there's huge amounts of warnings from the New Testament, early on in the New Testament leaders, who would say, if you're not 1 Thessalonians, if you're not going to work, then you don't get to eat. Right? Paul says this because there's groups of people who would be like, well, Jesus is going to come back, so I'm just going to sit around and not do anything. Right? And Paul's warning to them is no, you have to contribute. You have to put into this whole thing, right?
Yeah.
He tells one of his proteges, Timothy, Paul in 1 Timothy chapter 5, he says this, if a man's unwilling to work, then he's worse than an unbeliever.
Wow.
If you're not willing to work and provide for your family, then you should be treated as an unbeliever within the church. Paul's harsh about this, right? So me calling you lazy, not that big of a deal. You'll live, right? So part of this process, we have to learn this rhythm that yes, there's work, but then there's rest. And our identity does not come from either one of them. Our identity comes from the resting one, sorry. Not this idea that we need to earn everything and have this title of whatever your title would be. Does that make sense? You have an identity of Jesus, right? So, there's that one. Now let's jump to Exodus chapter 20. Let me give us the background of Exodus chapter 20. This is the next part that we see the Sabbath in this part of this. So, the context here is that the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, have gone to Israel. They spent 430 years enslaved in Egypt. And they're very specifically building this one new technology, the brick. Now, we've seen this before, Genesis chapter 11, the humans get obsessed with the brick. Latest technology. A few generations later, there's an entire empire who has exploited and enslaved an entire other group of people to build their bricks. That's all Israelites are building. Bricks to build their supply cities, to hold extra grains, to hold the excess of their things. If you want to have an empire that's going to rule the world, you need a cheap labor force. Right? The Israelites were that cheap labor force in the Egyptians' mindset. Only because they were so consumed with their technology. The question is there anything new under the sun? Not really. As a culture, are we obsessed with technology? And as a culture, do we know where the technology comes from? Are we aware the threads all the way through to the raw resources that get our technology? Are we exposing and exploiting groups of people so that we have the latest trends of technology, solar panels, lithium batteries, fabrics for our clothing? Or are we just simply saying, oh, look at this, I got a great deal on this? Are we any different than the Egyptians? I'll let it sit there. So, God calls Moses and says, hey, Moses, go confront Pharaoh and say, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, let my people go, right? And we got a whole song out of it. It's kind of cool if you grew up in church, all that fun stuff. And so, Moses does this, and he confronts Pharaoh. And notice how Pharaoh responds, right? I'm just going to read this to you. This is the one paragraph of Pharaoh's response. He says this, why are you taking people away from their work and their labor? Get back to work. You are stopping them from working. Pharaoh also says, make them work harder for the people so they keep working. Lastly, he says this, lazy, that's what you are, you're lazy. That is why you keep saying, let us go and sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will have to now build these bricks without straw, but have to keep your quota. Does anyone's boss sound like this? Do more with less, perform miracles, right? Somehow just make it work, right? So, here's the deal. Our enemy would like us to think that Pharaoh is still alive. But we're going to see that Pharaoh dies off, that Pharaoh is conquered. But that idea, that agenda, that mantra is still going to keep going through and all of these things, right? And so, God rescues them, and the whole plagues happen, all that dismantling of the entire theology of the Egyptians and the government system of the Egyptians. In Exodus 19, God says to them, he's meeting them on Mount Sinai, and he's saying this, hey, by the way, get ready, because I'm going to show up. And he's not talking just to the elite. He's not talking just to the priests. He's talking to the entire nation. Women, men, children, old, doesn't matter, fat, skinny, rich, poor, everyone. And he's saying to them, you will be for me a nation of priests. You will represent me to this entire world. Right? So get ready. And then Exodus chapter 20 happens, the next day happens. And he shows up, and part of this is the Sabbath. And let me just read this Sabbath to us. Here's Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do no work, but on the seventh day, that is a Sabbath day to the Lord. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor your daughter, your male, female servants, your animals, or any foreigner residing in your towns. For 6 days the Lord made the heavens, and the earth, and the seas, and everything in them, and then he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath, and he made it holy. And when he says something about making it holy, he's making it separate. He's making it set apart. When we think about holy, it's not just like a list of things to do, but are you set apart? Are you different somehow than the world? So, remember the Sabbath, but why? In Exodus, he's pointing it back to Genesis' account, right? And so, he's doing this. Now, here's the history of it. Shocker, Israelites do not keep the Sabbath. They don't keep the covenant. And so, this generation of Israelites who've been freed out of Egypt, out of Exodus, Egypt and all that, they eventually will die off. They will not go into the promised land. So this next generation of people will. And Moses leads their children. So if you think about this, there's a summary book in the Torah, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, and that's Deuteronomy. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers are written to the parents, the people who actually got taken out of slavery. Deuteronomy is written for the children because the first generation is going to die off because they won't follow God. And then God tells Moses to gather all the kids together. And let's talk about this. So he gives them a summary book, which is Deuteronomy, and he's talking to them, and he's giving them the whole layout of everything. And in this, here's what he says in Deuteronomy chapter 5. He says this, and there's differences in here, and there's similarities in here. First thing he says this, observe the Sabbath and keep it holy. How did Exodus read? Remember. The word here in Hebrew is sakar, which is meaning you will remember it, but you also will observe it. It's not just an idea to be like, yeah, I remember those days, right? But to observe it. And so, in the Kadesh, which is the Hebrew literature of how they would celebrate everything, there's this whole process of this. And the mother of the household, when the Sabbath starts, which is Friday night for them in the Jewish culture, the mother of the house would light 2 candles. And the children of the house would say, we remember and we observe the Sabbath. And I got to watch this play out when I was in Israel, and it was fascinating to watch like 20 minutes of an hour before sundown, and like people were rushing to get everything done. Trying to get to the point where they could rest for 24 hours, knowing that nothing was going to be open. And then as we were walking through this village, the candles were starting to light. And it was kind of sweet to see these families get together. They've been practicing this for 3,000 plus years. The same way, to remember and to observe. And then the Deuteronomy passage goes on, but then here's where the change happens, to the point where it's like the reason. Here's what it says. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath. So there's the remember and all that. But then also the difference is, hey, you guys were slaves in Egypt. And as you're observing the Sabbath, don't give in to the machine of this. Don't give in to the idea that you have to just like keep being products of the culture around you. And also this idea of remembering is simply like this. Don't repeat what is being done. Remember the pattern of history is that the oppressed become the oppressors. And part of the Sabbath is that we can resist this whole empire mantra. That we do not have to be the products of the culture around us. So what does it look like to do this? What does it look like to resist? And here's how I picture this. Genesis and Exodus are like Bob Ross paintings. If you want to put that up for me, Tom. This is what it's like this tranquil, like, oh, it's all like this. And if you remember, there's no mistakes, right? It's just happy accidents, right? And this is what it's like. It's like tranquil. It's like, this is awesome. This is how it should be, right? It's just Bob Ross. But then if you look at Deuteronomy is like a punk rock resistance, right? It is like, we are not going to be part of this system. We are going to down the man and all this other stuff. Deuteronomy's like, man, we're coming after you, right? We're not going to be part of the system. Bob Ross is all tranquil, like happy-go-lucky. Deuteronomy's like this active resistance. And this is what I think we should be as followers of Jesus. A little bit of both. Have your Bob Ross moments, but then resist the empire, the culture around you. And what does it look like to do that? A couple different things. Simply stop. Embrace the Sabbath for what it is. It is part of our identity. It is how we are wired. That if we constantly try to work, you're going to eventually hit a wall. And God will get your attention somehow, hopefully. Right? Like how many people we know just work, and then have a heart attack? We see it all the time, don't we, in our stories, in our news and stuff like that. And so part of this process is like, God has designed this so that we don't have to do this over and over again, that we can actually pause. And we can just simply rest. And we stop. And in that active resistance, we are saying, God, we don't work for our boss. We work for you. Our identity is out of you, out of the source of what you would speak over us. Not the things of this world. Right? And the other part of this is that we're just going to simply embrace who God has created us to be. And we don't have to earn anything. And it's like Roland was saying, it's an easy thing just to sit around. Right? And there's 4 rhythms of how to actually Sabbath. We stop, we delight, we rest, and then we worship. And in this process, you have to learn how to stop. And the stopping is maybe one of the most challenging parts of this. Just so you know, my routine here is I teach Monday through Friday, and then when school is done, if there's anything left at church, I have to kind of wrap up. I get done here, and I get as quickly as I can, but by 5:30, no matter what, I'm done. And if something did get done here, oh well, right? It'll happen at some other point, right? And so part of the process is learning how to work, but then at 5:30 on Friday night, I'm done. And then I don't look at my phone, I don't touch my phone, I don't wear my watch until at least 6 o'clock on Saturday. Because, and this is part of, remember the whole, like, doctors, lawyers, and pastors are the 3 professions that are given to this idea of like becoming more and more like the world around us. What I've literally had to say out loud before is, God, you hold this universe in this hand, in the palm of your hand, you've kept everything going. I'm going to trust that you can help that family out during this time. That the people of Rethink Church for 24 hours, God, you're going to have somehow sustain them.
Yeah.
Or they'll sustain themselves and stuff like that. It's an act of resistance to say, it's not me building this church.
Yeah.
And I've had to push in on pastors that I coach and that I train up and stuff like that, that you have to live by this promise that Jesus said that he would build this church, not us.
Yeah.
We just simply partner with him.
That's good.
And so in that reality, for 24 hours, I don't do anything. I play some video games. Right now I'm in the Call of Duty Cold Wars.
Yeah.
I'm just playing the campaign. And I set it for 90 minutes. And when the 90 minutes is done, you get up. Because I will become that person who, like, 2,000 hours? Yeah, I can do that. In a year, right?
It's easy.
It's easy to do, but I'm like, I'm 90 minutes and that's it. I listen to some music. Sometimes I journal, and I usually end my Sabbath by thanking God and journaling. And here's what I'm starting to really thank God more and more. God, I have the option of choosing what I want to eat today. I chose what kind of clothing I wanted to wear. I'm thanking God for what I have and not what I don't have. And part of this resistance to this, like, there's this huge push of like, what you don't have, you need to identify your life by that. Instead of sitting in the gratitude that you have, that God has provided for you in certain ways. And part of that is that process. And this next part, like Heather and I find these ebbs and flows. We don't do it perfectly all the time, but we really try to go 24 hours without spending money. 24 hours in 1 week to say, you know what? We don't need to spend money, because if we do, we're just helping other people avoid the Sabbath. And we're just part of the process. We're part of the agenda. We're part of the machine and all of that. So here's the invitation for you. Find a 24-hour window this week to stop, to delight, to rest, and then to worship. And see what it feels like. It's going to be weird, and I'm going to love it. Right? So, part of this process, you're going to be like, I don't like this. I know. You can enjoy it. You thought silence and solitude for a few minutes a day was rough. If you've never Sabbath before, embrace it. Right? And just simply go with it. Some of you, the challenge you need to find is this. Go get a job. Work 6 days or 5 days. And rest one. Not work 1 day and rest for 6 days. Right? Now, if you're a kid and you're like school and you have a part-time job, I completely understand that. Maybe you put that effort into school. How about that, right? But the whole 6 in 1 thing, it's crucial. This is work is not a result of the fall. Let's put it that way.
Right.
Adam was given the commandment to work before the sin entered this world. So go work. Takes 24 hours without spending money. Let's pray. God, thanks for this day. Thanks for who you are. God, thanks that you set this into motion well before we could even think about it. And psychologists and sociologists are just now catching up to your wisdom in this. God, would you allow us as your people to be, not to do? And as we learn to be more like you and who you created us to be, help us to work from that source. We don't have to earn your love, your appreciation. That we just simply get to be part of who you created us to be. And that you love us, and that you're well pleased with us. And out of that, would you help us to work, to contribute, to advance your kingdom in this world. And for some of us, our waters are so stirred up and so just jolted that it may take longer for us to settle. And God, would you allow those times? Would you bless the 24 hours that we're in the Sabbath this week? And others of us, we know this, that sometimes it's just hard to find jobs. Sometimes we're choosing not to find jobs. God, would you motivate people to go work? We can see work as worship. With a good attitude, on time, ready to do whatever the task is. But we're going to worship you through the way we work. And God, would you bless us? And help us to simply rest in who you've created us to be. We love you, Jesus. It's in you we pray this. Amen. Well, if you need prayer for anything, I'd love to meet with you back at the Green Wall. And if you're new with us today, just stop in the guest services. We'd love to connect with you and hear from you. Church, I hope you know this to be true, that God loves you, and I love you, and as we follow him, we'll counter the best he has to offer for us. So let's go and be the church. Have a good week. We'll see you next Sunday.